Dog barks loudly at pregnant black woman. But when police realized the truth, it was too late. Danielle stood near gate B12, one hand resting gently on her belly, the other clutching a small tote bag filled with nothing more than travel essentials and her prenatal vitamins. Her ankles ached. The flight had been delayed again. The terminal buzzed with soft boarding announcements, squeaky luggage wheels, and the occasional hum of travelers on calls. But then, a sharp, guttural bark shattered the normal airport din. It cut through the space like a siren. Heads turned, conversations halted. Danielle flinched. She turned toward the sound, heart beginning to race. The dog was huge, at least 90 pounds of taut muscle, fur bristled, eyes locked on her. It barked again, this time louder, harsher, and holding the leash, knuckles white with tension, was a white airport security officer in full uniform, Officer Radley. He was already walking toward her, jaw set, sunglasses still on despite being indoors, his other hand hovering too close to his holster. "Step away from the bag," he barked, louder than the dog. Danielle's body tensed. "It's just my bag. I have medical things. I'm pregnant. I just came from a prenatal visit." She spoke calmly, even as her voice cracked around the edges. She had nothing to hide. She had cleared TSA. She had shown her ID. She had followed every rule, every policy. But the air had changed. She knew this feeling, the subtle shift from being a person to being a target. And she also knew that no amount of calmness could undo it once it started. The dog, though, didn't look at her. Not really. Its head was tilted past her, ears flattened, barking not with hostility but with desperation. It wasn't Danielle it was focused on, but something behind her. Something Radley refused to notice. His attention never shifted. "Ma'am, step away from the bag and get on your knees, now." His voice had dropped an octave. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed, especially by people he didn't see as equals. His shoulders squared. His stance widened. The dog pulled again, more frantic now, clearly trying to move, not at her, but past her. Still, Radley kept the leash tight. His voice was sharper now, thick with assumption. "Are you refusing to comply?" Danielle's throat went dry. She glanced to her left. A woman with a rolling suitcase watched, eyes wide, but did nothing. A man with a neck pillow pulled out his phone but kept walking, the bystander effect in full force. And Danielle? She stayed still, hands visible, breathing shallow. "Please," she said again, this time barely a whisper. "I think something's wrong, but it's not me." But Radley didn't hear her or didn't care, because he wasn't listening for truth. He was listening for defiance, and to him her fear sounded too much like attitude. Then it happened fast. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. A man stepped out from an employee-only corridor, wearing a reflective vest that looked almost official, but not quite. His stride was urgent, wrong, and his eyes fixed directly on her, not on security, not on the crowd. Her. In his hand glinted the unmistakable steel edge of a blade. The barking exploded. The dog lunged violently, nearly dragging Radley with it. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Her hand instinctively covered her belly. "He's behind me," she shouted, eyes wide. "He has a knife!" But Radley didn't turn. His posture stiffened further, his gun now halfway drawn, still pointed at her. The attacker broke into a sprint. Danielle stumbled backward. The leash snapped from Radley's grip. In an instant, the dog surged forward, racing past her and colliding full force with the man inches before impact. The blade flew from his hand and clattered against the terminal floor. The man went down hard, the dog pinning him by the shoulder. Gasps echoed. A child screamed. People scattered. Finally, Radley turned. Too late. A second officer sprinted onto the scene from a security checkpoint. Radios buzzed. Orders were shouted. Travelers ducked behind luggage carousels. And Danielle stood there, stunned, shaking, adrenaline surging through her chest like fire. The only reason she was alive, the only reason she hadn't been killed by a stranger or mistaken for a threat, was because the dog had done what the man holding the badge hadn't, paid attention to the truth. Radley stood still now, shoulders tight, eyes darting between Danielle and the subdued attacker. His face was pale. His hand, still hovering near his holstered weapon, trembled. He had almost drawn on a pregnant black woman in the middle of a terminal. On a woman who had done everything right. The German shepherd stood over the groaning attacker, chest heaving, its bark now gone, its point proven. Danielle lowered herself to the floor, not from injury, but from the weight of everything that had just happened. Travelers resumed movement. Murmurs rose again. Some recorded. Most walked on. But a few, just a few, looked at her differently now, like maybe they were beginning to understand. And Radley? He couldn't look her in the eye. He had almost pulled the trigger, because of the color of her skin, because of a story he carried long before this day began. But it was the dog that saved her, not the officer sworn to protect her, not the system trained to suspect her, just the dog who saw something real when no one else would. Danielle sat in the terminal's private medical room, her hands trembling slightly as she held a paper cup of water that had gone warm in her grasp. The nurse had confirmed that her baby's heartbeat was steady, no signs of physical trauma, but that wasn't the only thing that mattered. Her body might be whole, but something inside her had been rattled loose, something she hadn't fully named yet. There had been a moment, less than a breath long, when she believed she might not make it home, that her baby might never be born, not because of a criminal, but because of a cop, a man with a badge who saw her as a threat before he saw her as a mother, a man who held a leash and a gun and still couldn't tell where the danger really was. Outside the room, the terminal buzzed with recovery. The attacker had been taken away in handcuffs, his motives still unclear, but his weapon and body language had made one thing obvious. Danielle had been a target, but for Officer Radley, that hadn't mattered. Not until the dog had broken free, not until the facts barked louder than his prejudice. And now, even with the situation over, the weight of his decision still hung in the air. Word was already spreading. Someone had recorded the incident from a nearby charging station. The video had gone up within minutes. On it, you could clearly see the officer's drawn weapon, the woman's hands raised, the dog lunging, not at her, but past her. The comments were flooding in. People were asking questions, not about the attacker, but about the officer who aimed his weapon at the wrong person. Danielle remained quiet. She didn't want to speak until she had control of her breath again, until the shaking stopped. But as she sat in that small white room surrounded by the faint hum of vending machines and security chatter over radios, she began to realize this wasn't just a close call. This was a mirror, a reminder that even here, inside a monitored, locked-down, security-heavy building, racism didn't need a reason. It didn't need logic. It just needed a target, and this time the target had been her. Meanwhile, Radley sat in a back office, face blank but his mind unraveling. He had already spoken to his supervisor, already written the first version of his report. He called it a routine security check that escalated due to suspicious behavior. He wrote that the woman had refused to follow immediate orders and that a confrontation with an unknown male interrupted a potential detainment. He didn't mention her race. He didn't have to. He also didn't mention that she had begged him to look behind her, that she'd said please more than once, that the dog had been pulling in the opposite direction the entire time. His report was full of passive language, like it had all just happened around him, instead of because of him. But Radley felt the shift. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before, with other officers, in other towns. Incidents that went viral, moments caught on camera that refused to fade. And now, he was the man behind the sunglasses, frozen in a frame where everything he believed had been proven wrong by the one creature trained to obey him. The dog hadn't attacked Danielle. It had protected her, and the realization stung deeper than he expected. Not because he felt remorse, but because he had lost control of the story. Internal Affairs arrived later that evening. They moved quickly, their questions crisp and clinical. Danielle answered everyone with composure, her tone even. She told them exactly what happened, From the moment the dog barked to the moment she hit the floor, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't editorialize. She didn't have to. The truth spoke for itself, and now there was footage to back it up. One of the investigators nodded solemnly and said, "We'll review the body cam, Mom." But Danielle knew that didn't mean justice. It just meant process. Later, as the lights in the terminal dimmed for the night shift, Danielle stepped outside into the cool air beyond the arrivals deck. She needed space. Space to breathe. Space to exist without eyes scanning her up and down like luggage on a belt. The German Shepherd, now calm, silent, sat beside another officer a few feet away. The officer loosened the leash and let the dog walk toward her. Slowly, carefully. She crouched, her back against a metal pillar, one hand on her belly, the other reaching out. The dog pressed its head into her palm, and in that moment Danielle broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet stream of tears slipping down her face as she whispered, "You knew. You knew I wasn't the threat." She didn't cry because of what almost happened. She cried because it took an animal to see her humanity. Radley watched from inside the terminal, standing near the glass doors. For a brief second, something in his expression shifted. Not regret, not empathy, just discomfort, like he was being shown something he didn't want to see, that his assumptions had been exposed, that no amount of training could undo what had just unfolded in front of witnesses, phones, cameras, and worst of all, the dog. The dog had chosen the right side, and he hadn't. By morning, the video had over 400,000 views. News outlets were calling it an incident of mistaken profiling. Commentators debated whether Radley's actions were understandable given the environment. But those who looked deeper saw what Danielle already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was what happened when racism was allowed to wear a badge and call it instinct, when bias was dressed as procedure, when being black and pregnant at the airport was enough to get a gun pulled on you. And yet, Danielle stood, not because she wasn't tired, not because she had to, but because she refused to disappear. The dog sat at her side, still and watchful, and for the first time since everything happened, she didn't feel entirely alone. By the time the sun stretched its gold through the airport windows, the story had already left the building. It was on every screen, in every inbox, climbing every algorithm. The video, shaky and imperfect, captured everything. Officer Radley, tense and postured, weapon half drawn. Danielle, hands raised, voice trembling, pregnant belly impossible to ignore. The dog, barking wildly, trying to break free. And then the moment of collision, the attacker coming into view and the dog lunging, saving a life while the man in uniform stood frozen in his bias. Danielle had watched it once. That was all she could stomach. She didn't need a replay of her trauma to validate what she knew in her bones. But others watched again and again, dissecting every second, arguing in comment threads, sharing with captions that ranged from "she could have died" to "he never even looked behind her." It spread not because people were shocked. It spread because they weren't. Because this wasn't the first time someone who looked like Danielle had been mistaken for a criminal. It just happened to be one of the few times it was caught before someone ended up dead. At the airport, the tone had shifted. Officers who had walked past Danielle hours earlier without a glance now offered empty nods, stammered apologies, or gave her wide berth altogether. The chief of airport police issued a carefully worded statement about reviewing officer conduct and safety protocol, the kind of message that sounded like accountability but meant little. Danielle ignored it. Her focus was on her child, on her peace, on what to do with this fire that had been lit beneath her feet. Meanwhile, Radley was pulled from duty pending the investigation. He'd been stripped of his badge and gun, not publicly, not dramatically, but in a quiet office with the blinds drawn. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His silence was its own confession. There was no way to explain why he'd aimed at a woman with nothing in her hands and fear on her face. No way to talk around the fact that a dog had done more to assess the situation than he had. He tried, of course. In his written statement, he talked about training response, about high alert behavior, about following protocol under pressure. But the footage made it all sound like noise. People weren't buying the excuses. The truth was visible, frame by frame. Danielle was contacted by reporters, some local, some national. They all wanted her quote, her angle, her thoughts on what it felt like. But Danielle wasn't interested in feeding the media machine that would move on once the clicks dried up. Instead, she released a single written statement, 10 simple lines typed from her phone while sitting in a hospital room waiting for a second checkup on her baby. I was silent because I was scared. I complied because I wanted to live. I warned him because I didn't want anyone to die. He didn't hear me because he didn't see me. He saw a threat, not a person. He saw color, not context. He aimed without cause. The dog saved me. The system almost didn't. But I'm still here. The statement was shared tens of thousands of times. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. It cut deeper than outrage. It revealed the quiet terror of being unseen. It gave shape to what so many people of color experience in airports, banks, grocery stores, sidewalks, parking lots, this constant balancing act between compliance and survival. The hearing was scheduled quickly. The airport's leadership wanted to get ahead of the story to show the public they were taking action. It was a closed session, but the results would be public. Danielle was invited to attend and speak. She thought about it for a day. Then she said yes. The morning of the hearing, Danielle dressed carefully, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she wanted to feel whole walking into a place that had tried to strip her humanity away. She wore black, simple, powerful. Her belly had grown since that day, her son, alive and kicking, unaware of the battle his mother had walked through for him. She entered the hearing room quietly, eyes steady, back straight. Radley sat across from her, suit pressed, expression unreadable. The panel asked questions, played the footage, paused it, replayed it, asked him to explain. He did, with careful words and no conviction. Danielle listened, unmoved. When it was her turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She told the truth in full sentences, with a calm that rattled the walls more than anger ever could. "I knew the moment he looked at me," she said. "I've seen that look before. It says, you're not supposed to be here. It says, your presence is suspicious. It says, my fear is more valid than your life. And it's the kind of look that gets people like me hurt or killed. I was lucky. I was lucky the dog knew better. I was lucky someone recorded it. But I shouldn't have to be lucky to be treated like a human being." The room went silent, not out of shock, but out of shame, because no one could deny it. No one could argue with it. She had lived it, and she had lived through it. Outside the hearing room, people waited. Not just journalists, not just activists. People, strangers, mothers, fathers, travelers who had seen the video and seen themselves in it. They didn't chant. They didn't hold signs. They just stood, quietly, in solidarity. Danielle stepped out and was greeted with silence that meant something. It was respect. It was grief. It was power. And when she spoke again, it wasn't with anger. It was with clarity. "I'm not the first this has happened to, but maybe I can help make sure I'm one of the last." She didn't stay for the verdict. She didn't need to. She had already won something deeper than a disciplinary ruling. She had reclaimed her voice, and in doing so, she gave voice to thousands of others who had been quiet too long. Danielle didn't wait for the outcome of the internal review because she already knew how these stories usually ended, with delays, with deflection, with words like retraining and reassessment instead of words like apology or justice. Still, she walked out of that hearing lighter than when she walked in, not because she believed the system would fix itself, but because she had refused to stay small inside of it. That mattered more than any headline. 2 days later, the verdict came. Officer Radley had been terminated from his position at the airport, effective immediately. The official statement cited failure to act in accordance with threat assessment protocol and gross negligence during a live security incident. It didn't mention race. It didn't have to. Everyone who had seen the footage already knew. But Danielle noticed what was missing. No charges, no formal acknowledgement of the profiling, no word from Radley himself. Just silence. Danielle sat on the couch in her apartment, one hand on her belly, the other resting on the retired police dog's back as he lay beside her. The media had moved on to the next viral clip, the next public mistake. But for her, life was just beginning again. Her son, still unnamed in the early days, kicked constantly now, full of life, like he was claiming his own space in the world. Eventually, she settled on a name, not from anger, not from pain, but from defiance and pride. She named him Justice, not because the world had given it to her, but because she would raise him to know he deserved it, even when the world didn't recognize it. The dog, once a tool of the state, now slept at her feet, followed her through the apartment, and rested beside her when she read out loud. She hadn't planned to adopt him, but after the investigation, it had been quietly suggested that he be retired early. Too unpredictable, they said, too emotionally bonded. But Danielle knew better. He wasn't unpredictable. He just followed a truth deeper than orders. He had protected her when his handler wouldn't. He'd seen her when others had only seen suspicion. For weeks, Danielle received letters from mothers, from daughters, from strangers who had never been in her shoes, but had still felt the squeeze of fear when walking through security, through stores, through life. One woman wrote, "You didn't just survive, you showed us how to speak." Another message came from a teenage girl who said she had never seen someone who looked like her walk into power without needing to yell. "You were calm," she wrote, "but your truth was louder than any scream." Danielle saved those letters, all of them, because they reminded her that survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. She began volunteering at local community centers, speaking to young women about presence, about navigating spaces that weren't made for them. She told her story when she was ready, when it mattered, not just for shock, but for purpose. People listened, not just because she had gone viral, but because her words held weight. She wasn't telling them how to survive injustice. She was telling them how to live beyond it, how to build something from it. One afternoon, months later, she returned to the airport, not as a traveler, not as a protester, just as a citizen. The arrivals area buzzed like always. Tired passengers, excited reunions, luggage dragging over tile. She stood near a bench, watching the ebb and flow, her son strapped to her chest in a soft carrier, the dog sitting obediently beside her. No one stopped her, no one questioned her, but people recognized her. A woman in a TSA uniform nodded gently. A flight attendant passing by whispered, "Thank you," as she moved to her gate. She didn't need attention. She didn't need applause. Her presence was enough. In the quiet of that terminal, she thought about what had happened and how close she had come to being erased. Not just from a single mistake, but from an entire system built to ignore people like her. She had followed the rules. She had spoken clearly. She had done everything right. And still, the only thing that saved her was a dog, because the man trained to protect her couldn't see past his fear long enough to hear her voice. That's what racism looks like. Not always in slurs or violence. Sometimes it's in the hesitation, in the assumptions, in the way silence wraps around danger until it's too late. Racism is the way people justify fear without asking what it's costing someone else. And sometimes it almost costs everything. But there's a truth that's louder than fear. It's in our stories. It's in our presence. It's in our refusal to be small or quiet or erased. Racism is taught, but so is resistance. And every time we speak, every time we stand, every time we survive and still choose to love, to raise our children, to claim space, we unteach what was built to divide us. Danielle didn't need a courtroom's approval to know what was right. She didn't need an apology from Radley to feel whole. What she needed What we all need is for our stories to matter, to be heard, to be held, to be believed the first time. Because the next time someone sees a black woman and hears a dog barking, they need to ask not what is she hiding, but what is she warning us about that we refuse to see. And in that shift, in that moment of listening before judgment, that's where real change begins. Not in policies, not in press releases, but in people who refuse to look away. People like you, watching this, reading this, sitting with it. Because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And now it's on you to speak.